Hi, welcome to our in-person audience and to our online audience. In-person audience, thank you for coming out on a wet, rainy, dark Friday to share this moment in person, and online audience, thank you for tuning in. So my name's E.J. Monagulland. I'm a professor of biodiversity in the biology department, and I also lead the Oxford Martin programme on wildlife trade and the Oxford Martin programme on biodiversity and society. So this is a particularly interesting talk that's going to really kind of speak to both of those themes. So it's really exciting to have Tim Wittig here. He's a guy who kind of spans academia and practice in a way that's quite unusual and quite difficult to do. So, you know, he held a tenure position at the University of Groningen until 2019, which he then resigned in order to go into practice. But while he had that, he had all sorts of other things that he was doing as well. So, for example, he's senior analyst and head of intelligence and analysis for the United for Wildlife, Transport and Financial Task Forces, which he's been doing since 2016. That's a programme of the Royal Foundation. And that kind of combines intelligence with commitments to make sure that the world's shipping and transport and financial industries work together to address global wildlife trafficking. He's also CIO and head of intelligence for Focus Conservation, which is an NGO that brings major wildlife traffickers and corrupt facilitators to justice. So he's got a really strong background in intelligence and in risk management and compliance and illicit networks. So he wrote a very well-reviewed book in 2011, for example, on terrorist finance. But recently, I think his heart is in wildlife. And so recently he's moved away from the generic kind of finance into more kind of wildlife-focused work, particularly around wildlife trafficking. But he's also got interests in helping companies to better understand their nature impacts and how to disclose their financial impact on nature. So he's part of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is something that's very big in terms of trying to change the way that investment works towards nature. So he wrote the preliminary standard for the TNFD in 2020. So Tim's a real kind of Renaissance man in the best sense of the word, someone who's really got a deep understanding of finance, of terrorism, and of wildlife, and brings them together to make change happen in the real world, while also having a really strong academic and scientific background. So thank you very much, Tim. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, EJ, for that really kind introduction. So today, and it's great to be here. Today we're going to be talking about towards a single common information architecture for sustainable investing. We'll be talking about ESG, so the whole phenomenon of environmental social governance, ESG data. And then also talking about United for Wildlife, as EJ mentioned, as kind of a case study in how to how to go about using information to change company behavior, corporate behavior, private sector practices that relate to sustainability in the environment, or as I put it here, creative disruption of an industry for sustainability. And then we'll talk about some key concepts for a future architecture, a better architecture for sustainable investing, for information around it. And then this concept of a new logistics of data. Okay, so just to introduce myself. So as EJ said, I kind of split my career between practice and academia. But I think I feel like I've been doing the same job regardless, kind of what institution is part of. So the practice and the study of how finance can be used for impact. Okay, and then underlying that, how information is used for that. Okay, so I worked, did my PhD at St. Andrews, so lived in the UK for a long time, mostly in Scotland. And as EJ mentioned, been the last 6-7 years, been working for with the Royal Foundation and United for Wildlife and Focus Conservation. I started my wildlife career with WCS as their kind of senior analyst, looking at wildlife trafficking globally for WCS. So kind of worked in a big NGO setting also. Before that, kind of had a previous life, was actually worked for the US Department of Defense in the intelligence world, but also worked with several data science teams throughout that time, mostly on national security problems, especially around threat finance and terrorist financing. And so Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, APL is a great place to work. It's in Maryland. They invented GPS, among other things, and also recently hit that asteroid. They have a space program, and they're also the ones that sent the thing to Pluto. So that was a really cool place to work, and also did some projects with DARPA back a long time ago. And that was, I am not a data scientist, but I was the qualitative person, or the domain expert, sometimes they call it, or the domain architect or something like that, working with the data scientists. So really learned a lot from that. That was really interesting. And actually, one thing that you'll see, or that I've learned, is that when you talk about the research process, scientific method, the data science process, the intelligence cycle, they're all basically the same thing. So the way using information for an impact, for an effect, whether that is scientific findings or whether that's something like changing corporate sustainability practices, it's the same process. Okay. So let's get into it. So on sustainable finance, right? So sustainable finance. So first on terminology, I'm just going to say sustainability and ESG is the same thing. Okay, so I think we'll get into why there's no point in having a definition. So sustainable finance, on one hand, it's the next big thing, right? So by all estimates, by 2025, in a couple of years, there'll be $50 trillion of assets projected to be labeled as sustainable. There's huge consensus politically, normatively, in the policy world, among NGOs, among the business world, investment community, in all countries and all markets, that kind of the future of investing needs to be sustainable, and also that environmentally and socially oriented investment and corporate behavior and business behavior is really critical to saving the planet, saving society, having a sustainable future. Okay. Also, there's really just as wide consensus that systemic global issues pose a huge problem, a systemic threat, a systemic risk to business also, right? So it's both ways. There's a huge and ever-growing body of science that's documenting these specific impacts, how exactly business is impacting nature and society. EJ's group does a lot of really great work in that field. I think it's one of the best in the world on that. And there's a lot of growing behavior change. There's a lot of impetus and a lot of motivation and actually enthusiasm in private sector for being more sustainable. So some of this is probably you have to take with a grain of salt, or maybe more than that. But it is genuine. There's a genuine shift, I think, in mentality. And there's also this emergence of an industry serving all this, right? So I saw an estimate, $1.6 billion industry right now, projected 21% annual growth. So I think it's more than a cottage industry. It's all right. So that's on one hand. So that's all good. Kind of the bad and the ugly part is that there's a huge impact problem. Okay, there's no evidence of widespread positive impact yet from any of this. You can find ad hoc cases, but as far as scale, widespread, it's not happening. Okay, market problem. A big pitch of kind of the sustainable investing community and ESG proponents is that actually they're better investments. They're more profitable, okay? But actually, they've done a lot of analysis now. The Wall Street Journal is actually putting out a lot of this data, and ESG funds actually underperform the market, right? Currently, so there's a political problem. There's growing critique of this. I guess this is part of it, but there's growing critique of ESG, even to the extent that there's a explicit opposition now to ESG that's happening in the U.S. Although one could argue is that they're actually promoting ESG, just their own version, their own criteria, their own model of it. All right. And so there's a new MAGA, M-A-G-A ETF fund that's explicitly for that purpose, right? And there's a fraud problem, right? So greenwashing is usually the term we use, but I prefer the term fraud, okay? Fraud is when you make money by lying, essentially, by deceit. And so it's a criminal offense or it's a civil offense, right? So I think we should call greenwashing what it is, which is fraud. And if you're involving securities, as in investments, then that's securities fraud, all right? And so regulators and some of the enforcement investment, like the private sector enforcement bodies are looking into this a lot. Okay, there's a big data problem, garbage in, garbage out, right? So this is really what we're going to be talking about today, this garbage in, garbage out problem, right? So underlying all of those other problems is this, the fact that in a data science sense, we have garbage data and garbage models, right? And so meaning that there's no way for the good data and the good models to kind of find their way to the impact, right? So, and I would say there's a real risk of a sustainability winter, right? So there's a concept of like an AI winter, or basically where funding goes down, where interest goes down, where there's kind of I think there's been so much promise and so much promised, around ESG and around sustainability, that if these things are not addressed and they're not fixed, or at least there's an approach, a strategy for fixing them, then we could have a real backlash, okay, which would be the worst possible scenario, I think. All right, this is, you can see what even the OECD said. All right, so meanwhile, all of this is happening, and this is why we're all here, is that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, 60% decline in animal numbers, pandemics, on wildlife trafficking. World Bank, in a study that worked on, was estimate actually the real economic cost of just illegal wildlife and fishing and logging trade is probably around $1 to $2 trillion a year, right? So that's just this one issue, right? So obviously, I don't think this group, we need to go to the statistics, and that's not even talking about climate, health, structural inequalities around the world, authoritarianism, conflict. There's 2 genocides happening right now, and other systemic threats to people on the planet, right? So first of all, I think it's good to just maybe make a value statement, a normative statement first. So is victory even possible? Like, is this, so I think anybody that works in conservation probably has to be an optimist, okay? So I think it is. And I think my view on conservation is that the future of conservation really is about effective systems, right? So not kind of heroes, mythical or real. And so a system is a set of things working together as part of a mechanism, right? And I think one of the key things here, and we'll talk about United for Wildlife in this, is that the definition of who is a conservationist is changing. So kind of scientists, activists, celebrities, rangers, wildlife rangers, these are obviously, people that are a big part of the conservation world. But also the definition, I think, of who is a conservationist is and needs to change, or needs to expand radically, is that, and as we have systems, better conservation systems, that's a natural outcome of that, right? And so what this means is that really anybody can be a conservationist in the sense of anybody can have positive conservation outcomes, often from their normal job or, without doing anything, just kind of working on wildlife or conservation issues. And I think that's done through these systems. Right, okay, so that's kind of the introduction. Let's talk about ESG today. So this potentially fatal garbage in, garbage out data problem, right? So here's just kind of summarizes some of the problems. We'll go into some of this more in depth. Is that there's only a tiny fraction of ESG data that's needed to make decisions that's ever even captured. There's a lot of information failures. We'll go into those. There's no rigorous or consistent way to quantify, model, or predict ESG or sustainability things at scale, so you can do a little kind of point analysis, but no reliable basis for risk or measurement or prediction. Relevant stakeholders are, often disconnected from the decisions that are being made on the data or on their areas of expertise. And then obviously there's a huge problem of denialism, misinformation, disinformation, all of which is signal noise confusion. All right, so in some research that I've been doing, here's 58 data problems that we've identified in today's sustainability data ecosystem. Okay, so we'll go through just a couple of them. All right, but before we do, I want to talk about some historical antecedents about today's problem. Okay, so this is not the first time where we collectively have confronted a problem like this, where there's like a popular issue. Actually, I think this is the pattern. There's a popular issue. There's a lot of money that is associated with it, and then there's a lot of attention. Okay, and so one was actually speech recognition. In the 1960s, and this was all tied to all the huge amounts of research funding in the U.S. that came after World War II, and especially after Sputnik. And so this guy, John Pierce, he invented the word, he was the first person to use the word transistor, so he invented the concept of a transistor. So he was kind of a core establishment figure, in American engineering at the time. So he wrote this letter to the editor of the Journal of the Acoustic Society of America or something like that. And so he basically ripped apart speech recognition research. Okay, and he actually killed funding for speech recognition for like 30 years with this letter. And so what he talked about was glamour and deceit, okay, which I think is the best phrase, like one of the best phrases I've ever heard about, because it describes a lot of where you have broken systems, there's glamour and deceit, in the information there, okay. And so I'm sure you can read that and not think of anything relating to conservation or the environment that has anything to do with that, right? But actually another thing was, like EJ said, my first research topic that I did my PhD on was on terrorist financing. And actually, this was the same issue in terrorist financing, right? So if you want to join a really small elite, you can read my book about terrorist financing. But it was the same issue, right? Is that basically this enormous, after 9/11, there was this enormous system with billions of dollars being spent, lots of political pressure and lots of opportunity for entrepreneurs, and so this whole regulatory framework and this whole industry rose up to fight terrorist financing, but their version of terrorist financing was completely fictional, essentially. Or I would say it pertained to a tiny percentage of the actual problem, okay? And it pertained to the percentage of the problem that was easy to deal with through banks, right? And easy to that fit within the existing structures. All right. Again, I think those things, those phrases. And actually, here's a book written by a colleague. There's an article in a chapter in the book on the relationship between terrorist financing and poaching, ivory poaching in East Africa with Al-Shabaab. And so you can see, a lot of these problems with terrorist financing, they actually came up in conservation later, actually. So that was pretty thoroughly disputed by Kathy and team. All right, so then some of the other information failures that we're dealing with in the ESG space is, on the definitional and ontological side, right? So lack of standardized definitions, no terminology, ESG, sustainability, regeneration, all of these they have no, they can mean anything, which means they mean nothing. They have no, they don't contain any information, essentially. They're just phrases, marketing phrases, essentially. There's no lack of standardized domain models, right? So there's some really great research being done, some really great science. There's a lot of expertise on the practical side, but there's no kind of standardized way to kind of capture that. There's no transparency in the ESG scoring, and there's a lack of scientific basis, for these models, right? And so what this means is that the models, are not, that the good research and the good data or good analysis is not being taken up into industry, if we're talking about the sustainable investing space. And then the ones that they are using, the models, they hang around longer than they should, they're used longer than they should, or they change all the time. Okay, so it's a big mess, right? It's a Wild West data ecosystem, right? And the on the rating, so there are many companies now. They make a lot of money. They create ratings, so for funds or for a company about, are you doing sustainable things or not? Are you sustainable? And if someone wants to, invest in a company that's more sustainable, they'll look at the rating, and that's the way to do it. Okay, but these ratings have a lot of biases, right? So I just kind of took the biases and constructed an ideal company according to the ratings. All right, so this is the way you score the best, according to current ESG ratings, right? So a big company based in Europe, famous, in a mature regulated industry, all right? And so you can read it. So what this means is that, for example, companies that are doing innovative things in an emerging market, like in Africa or Latin America, they actually get hurt by this. Smaller companies, companies that actually report, that as you can see there, it actually kind of incentivizes fraud or potentially, secretive behavior, and also to look at the short term, right? So so these ratings, according to their biases, are really incentivizing exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do, right? And so these ratings, so there's 5 or 6, actually there's quite a few now, but there's, so the big ratings providers, right? So if these were based on some kind of actual quantitative data, right, the ratings should correlate with each other, okay, at least generally, right? And so, like for debt ratings, for like credit ratings, credit risk ratings, like Moody's, Standard & Poor's, those kind of established and highly regulated ratings, they correlate around 99%, 98% or something like that. All right, so this is the predictive power of ESG ratings. All right, so they're random. I mean, that's a random graph, right? So their ESG rating is a random figure. All right, so just to show you, so here are some things that correlate better than ESG ratings. All right, so that's one. Number of people who drowned in falling into a pool in Nicolas Cage films. All right, spelling bee, number of spelling bee letters in the winning spelling bee words, and number of people killed by spiders, right? And this just has a graphic, right? So that's correlation, not causation, right? And so, and then on top of that, there's big conflicts of interest, okay, in this space, right? So you have a basic, something standard in the financial world is that audit is separate from consulting, right? People can go to jail if they mix that, okay? But actually in the ESG space, you have the firm selling consulting services to the firms that they're supposedly evaluating, right? There's even pay to play, right? So there's even, a company will only be rated unless they pay the rater, right? So it's like those old Who's Who books, where it's like you have to pay to be in it. The regulated credit agencies are actually getting into the ESG space too, because there's a lot of money into it, which is also causing a lot of concern among the SEC and the European regulators about whether this could incentivize illegal behavior or reduction in credit risk ratings, which is a much bigger concern for them. And there's no regulatory requirement to disclose conflicts of interest in this space, right? So it seems like kind of an area rife for problems. On the data itself, it's really uneven. What it's covering in terms of industries, geographies, timescales, how far back it goes, what it covers, how detailed it is, depending on. There's a big elite preference. So disproportionate share of information is from prestigious organizations or famous organizations. So there's a big halo effect in all this data. So kind of the more famous something is, the more it's listened to. There's no kind of normalized data standards. There's very little mutual information between experts and domain experts and practitioners. And then there's very little transparency in where even this data came from, right? So actually, if you really look into data sets that are commercial data sets, and you actually look at where the data came from, almost always they came from a free scientific source. Okay, so that also begs the question: why would you pay for something that's free, right? Or if you're going to pay somebody, why not pay the university that did it to begin with? And then also a lot of climate data, for example, it's actually not data. It's not even data. It's extrapolated generalizations. Often sometimes it's called synthetic data, but it means it's not data, right? And so what that means is that maybe there's some climate observations about forest fires or whatever for specific geographies, but then they extrapolate that, all right? But who knows, like literally who knows whether that's a good, a quality generalization or not, right? Because you really have to look into this. You have to, there's very little transparency, so what this, so just kind of just listing some specific gaps. So critical data gaps, there's no, asset level data. It's even hard to find location data for companies. Where are they operating? It doesn't tell you a lot where their headquarters is. You have to know kind of where all their operations are, but that's not necessarily public. Lots of analytic gaps, especially on biodiversity, especially on non-climate issues. There's very little information to calculate, any kind of like price value. Are these fees fair? It's hard to get information or detect regulatory capture, for example. So like, are companies, are they influencing the regulators, in that? Are they influencing the government? And also transmission. There's a recent paper actually by one of the other groups in Oxford, just on transmission pathways, so cause and effect, about how investing actually impacts corporate behavior. So there's very little of this data, and it's definitely not done at scale, and there's definitely not enough to make any kind of decisions on it. There's enough to do marketing on it. There's definitely enough to do marketing, but there's not enough to make actual decisions. Yeah, and then there's also huge asymmetries in the information. Okay, so for example, there's actually an enormous, vast, enormous universe of ESG information out there that's already being collected. It could be collected better, probably, or almost certainly, right? But there's 10 million nonprofit organizations in the world, estimated, right? There's, I think there's 1.5 million in the US, like 3.5 million in India, right? So there's a huge amount of nonprofit organizations. Almost all of them are small and local, right? They're working on the ground, they're observing things, they're from those areas, they know the areas very well. They actually have a stake in the outcome of whatever decisions are being made, which is really important. They have skin in the game. And they're working in every single ESG domain already, right? And so, for example, in Africa, all over for the continent, Mali Asili, I think, estimated that 80% of all land is actually managed by community organizations, right? So what about their data? That would be very good data to analyze things on, and in the U.S., 1 out of 10 people work for an NGO, for a nonprofit. Okay, and so there's a huge amount of people. There's a huge amount of sensors, from a data perspective. There's a huge amount of information that's already being collected, right? Nobody needs to task these people. It's already being done, and it could just be done better, right? So here you have this enormous industry based on essentially free data, tiny subset, and then you have this enormous people, and these people are all, pretty much underfunded, right? So here's an example from the pandemic risk zoonotic spillover data supply chain, right? So about kind of what data, maybe there's some gaps here that you'll notice, but just to kind of illustrate, here's basically the types of data that you would need on the left. And then the true sources of those information. So like if you were to actually get that information, who would actually be collecting that data? And how would it be actually collected, right? Not where you would get it from, most likely, or who you would pay in the current environment, but who's actually collecting the data, right? So it's by community members, community leaders, local governments, NGOs, local NGOs working in health or conservation or whatever, local researchers, right? And so then you have all these gatekeepers, right? So the gatekeepers are the ones that are, they're the ones that if you want this type of data as an outsider, you have to probably go through, all right? But these gatekeepers are, they're extremely inefficient, it's very unfair, and it's also, they're also really restricting the amount of, hugely, the amount of data that's available. And there's a huge economic asymmetries here, because we're talking about money, right? And a lot of money, $50 trillion, that's definitely enough to go around. And so huge economic asymmetries, right? So these groups, these local groups, they have the best access and placement to data, right? They're the most valuable data types. They have the best prior knowledge, the best contextual information. Data's much more valuable if it has proper context. They have the most to lose from bad decisions being made with that data. So they're highly invested and incentivized into having good data, right? And providing good data. But they have the least economic stake in the data market. They have the least access to data science education, access to funding, and the least, probably zero, pretty much, input to any kind of decision making. And so, yeah, just you can see the numbers. So 0.13% of global climate funding, so that's like direct climate funding, goes to IPLCs, Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Organizations. So that's about $46 million, right? So that's nothing. I mean, that's essentially nothing. So, and then, and only even private philanthropy, only 5 to 10% goes directly to these local organizations, right? So there's huge economic asymmetries here. which we'll talk about. You fix the data problem, you actually fix those asymmetries too, those economic asymmetries. So they're tied together. So here, we'll just go through, talk about United for Wildlife a bit as a case study on how to creatively disrupt an industry, actually 2 industries. So United for Wildlife is a program of the Royal Foundation. The purpose is to create a framework to assist the private sector in combating the illegal wildlife trade, IWT, wildlife trafficking, in order to limit the loss of species, right? So it's a program of the Royal Foundation. It started with, I think, 12 or 14 transport companies, so shipping companies, airlines, in 2015, 2016. And then it's grown to about over 150 transport companies. I think over 80% of the shipping industry is a member. Most major airlines, none in the United States, actually, for some reason. And about 55 financial institutions. Basically, most or pretty much most of the large European and North American banks, plus many banks, a few banks in China, Vietnam, in Africa and Latin America. So some big regional banks too. Also, a lot of NGO partners, a lot of governmental partners, and actually the government of Colombia signed up as a country just recently. So the whole country of Colombia is also a member. There's an information sharing system, so that's what I was brought on as a consultant, because kind of my unique background had as a consultant to advise them on how to, there's a commitment in the declaration about acting on intelligence against wildlife trafficking, and so helped design that system and then been running that, overseeing that since then. That's through a grant from the Royal Foundation to now to Focus Conservation, this NGO. All right, so here's some lessons. So that's what United for Wildlife is. We had our global summit on Tuesday, and so it's actually, it's actually worked pretty well. I think maybe at the beginning, people didn't know how it was going to work out. There was a huge push from the top to really make this not a marketing exercise, to have some kind of real tangible outcome. We didn't actually know how we were going to do that, but we did. So I think here's the lessons learned. Right. So one is that wildlife trafficking is not one domain. Right. It's not one issue. It's actually lots of smaller issues. It's lots of mini domains. Right. So and each one of those has a separate kind of data infrastructure and practice model and action model. Right. So wildlife trafficking. So this is wildlife trafficking. You need different data, different information, different technology, different kind of normative frameworks, different ethical frameworks, legal frameworks, different ones apply, different objectives and action, depending on whether you're, even if you're gonna try to arrest a poacher versus you're gonna arrest a major international wildlife trafficker, it's different. Or stopping poaching is different than arresting poachers. They're totally different things are needed, right? And information. So they're actually different domains, So we call it all wildlife trafficking or IWT or illegal wildlife trade or something, right? But they're actually just, it's actually dozens, hundreds of different domains, maybe thousands, because every location is different also. And this actually, and the differences actually are, if there's any philosophers here, Aristotle has his theory of knowledge and his different types of knowledge virtues. So there's episteme, which is basically the rules, like science, and then techniques, like the how-to, and then phronesis is the highest form of knowledge virtue, and that's how to decide what to do in what circumstance. Okay, and then there's a great book actually written by a Danish professor, Making Social Science Matter, that kind of applies this phronesis to social science and then adds in power dynamics to it. It's I recommend the book to everybody. So definitely check that out. And so that's, yeah, so that's the, that's a huge lesson learned, right? Then the common kind of thread across IWT, across illegal wildlife trade is risk, right? So if there's one unit that kind of, so you have all these different domains with all these different things, but risk actually is if there's one kind of single unit to measure and quantify, it's risk. So that's risk to wildlife, risk to companies, risk to traffickers, and then there's all sorts of different risk models and risk. You can quantify it, and you can, for planning, you can avoid it. So for example, when law enforcement, they're actually trying to increase, so the strategy about why law enforcement, why arresting people is because it increases risk to wildlife traffickers and poachers, or it increases the perception of risk. So you're actually trying to increase risk for this specific group, but you're trying to decrease it, you know, and you're trying to do this. And importantly, you're trying to, a big part of what we did with United for Wildlife is actually, we worked at the human level, and we really tried to empower people within these companies to take risks themselves, right? So to, you know, risk as in like, I'm gonna spend my time on this. You know, I'm gonna spend a day, an hour, you know, working on wildlife trafficking. So we give them, we tried to work like, what do they need in terms of information and resources, or good feeling, or a nice invite to, you know, a meeting with where Prince William is there, or something like that. Like, and so I think one of the biggest, or maybe the biggest success, I think, and that we're all most proud of with United for Wildlife, is that now these companies are actually taking organic initiative to based on what they know, to fight wildlife trafficking. Okay, without coordination from us, without information or anything like that. You know, so it's Samlet. Actually, I just refer you to the Global Summit. So they were there giving a panel. And so these organic, self-starting kind of entrepreneurial initiatives. So risk-taking is a big part of that. So this data environment really helps with risk-taking also. Trust, having a trust model is also incredibly important. Action, you know, moves at the speed of trust. That's the, so this is how we did this. So a clear shared theory of action and a trust model, and collaboration. It's a team effort. And then kind of underneath all this is an information architecture, right? Is a marketplace. A marketplace in the sense of like connecting supply and demand. You know, not necessarily like an economic marketplace, but like a forum. And that's how this information sharing system evolved. So it started kind of this army of one, just a central, everything kind of going through one person, and then into a team, like a shared resource, and then an infrastructure. Right, so, but the main problem is scale and technology and resources, money. You know, to do this properly, you would probably have to spend like, well, many multiples of whatever would be available ever. Okay, so probably for this issue, it's not going to happen. But maybe for sustainable investing, you could build a sustainable an architecture like that. Right, so here's some principles about this kind of future architecture for sustainable investing. So one is that it's really about risk, not about impact, right? So we talk about impact for obvious reasons, but it's actually, I think it's a more quantifiable thing, a more rigorous way to understand it if you talk about risk. So risk to health, risk to people, risk to planet, risk to your domain model, right? As well as risk to the customers. Because risk can be quantified. And then once you quantify it, it can be modeled and predicted and even monetized and things like that, and eliminated. And it's good for planning and all that, right? So I think what that means is that sustainability, really the future, kind of sustainability is risk and vice versa. You know, it is kind of the future. So I think when maybe that's a redefinition we need to do. Need to massively scale up the data capture, right? So like I was talking about, there's this unbelievably large universe of data out there that's not being captured. So we need to figure out how to do that. And it needs to be done in a good way, right? I'll talk about that in a minute. And so I think one of the key things is that at source, you need to standardize and normalize that data, right? So that's kind of the big bottleneck just from a technical perspective. You're talking about domains, little domains. So I think there's this concept from actually the financial quant world. I'm working on a paper for this, and the co-authors, my co-author worked in finance, and he brought this concept of playbooks. And so what this means is that playbooks basically is like a consensus kind of domain model where you can involve expert community, you kind of set the standards, set metrics, set data sets and things like that, right? It's your analytic model. And then there's this continuous refinement through this common task methodology. So this is really interesting too, where it's this method. So going back to the glamour and deceit from the speech recognition guy. So actually, there was that winter, speech recognition winter for 30 years, no funding, no advancement. They even thought it couldn't be done. But then DARPA actually, some people there came up with this idea for a common task method where they have a well-defined metric for a specific problem, like a subdomain of the bigger problem, applied by a neutral agent. So in this case, I think it was National Institute of Technology Standards, something. Shared data sets, that's really important. And then you have to reveal their methods, right? So I think, and then there's some kind of competition where you're competing against the problem, not against each other. So even if you make 0.1% improvement, then you get rewarded, right? Actually, you get the same reward as a bigger one. And so I think this could actually be applied. I think in the conservation space especially, we're kind of set up for this. I think we'd have to adapt it also for qualitative information. But for example, like how do we collect, how is biodiversity collected, in a protected area, right? So there's lots of innovative ways to do that. How do we analyze this particular question, So this could be done. And then you're engaging, so you're setting a domain model, a metric through a neutral party, and then people compete against it, right? And it might be, and then often there's funding tied to the success too. And so basically this revolutionized speech recognition, right? So Google Translate, smartphone, voice recognition is all based on this common task method. This creating this marketplace, so like an infrastructure. So this, I stole this slide from my co-author, Jim. And so I think this is also how kind of AI, artificial intelligence, is moving too, is that it's moving from this point problems, descriptive analytics, singular models, to a scaled infrastructure where you can layer in different models and make predictions based on that, and using artificial intelligence to do this, right? But you can't do any of that if you don't have quantifiable data. Actually, a key part of that is the domain expertise. So data scientists cannot do this without domain experts, right? And the domain experts are not necessarily university expert scientists. It's a combination of scientists and especially people working on the ground that see this. And then the funding model has to change. None of this will work without changing the funding model. So one question actually is it nature that's being valued, or is it actually information about nature that's being valued? Because if you think about an NGO donor, are they paying for the impact, or are they paying for the report that supposedly shows the impact? Okay. One could argue that they're paying for the report, right? And then the logical step would be, hopefully that report is actually, describing something real, right? So in this way, actually maybe tying funding to data, there's a lot of potential there. So here's kind of an architecture diagram about it. So setting priorities, through these expert communities. That would include, kind of all relevant experts. Then the data capture, the analytics, and the end use, right? And it goes, and so if anyone knows the intelligence cycle, this is basically the intelligence cycle. If you know the data science, process, it's essentially the data science process too, right? Set priorities, collect the data, process and analyze it, and then use it, and then learn from the cycle. So in conclusion, I think what we're talking about, if there's a metaphor to use, maybe it's logistics, actually. So I think in some ways, when we think of information in the information age and data, we think of really modern, something modern and futuristic, right? But I think you can make an argument that actually this is like extremely old, right? The way the data world is structured right now. And so I would say specifically the 16th century, 17th century, right? Because in the 16th and 17th century, the world's kind of logistics and economics was based around, it was mercantilist. It was based around, large companies that were linked to empires, like the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. And they were basically vertically integrated extraction machines, where the people at the source of the commodities, were getting nothing. They were suffering a lot. They were, being manipulated, and a lot of damage was being done. And then all of this was to kind of serve the domestic manufacturing industry. So I think actually this is how data is structured today, right? You have kind of these mega companies and mega gatekeepers who control, they're basically vertically integrated extraction machines. And so, but then we revolutionized logistics and trade, since in the century since then. And so this is a picture of Rotterdam. I'm a huge fan of Rotterdam. It's like one of the most fascinating places. And so this is kind of the vision, I think, about, the way data could work. And this is how goods work. So our movement of goods is much more modern than data, and so so here's kind of the application. So like with nonprofits, scientific teams, academic scientists, also citizen scientists, small companies even. I mean, you can have entrepreneurial people that do this for their work. They can securitize in the sense of monetize data, own it, control it. They can decide who it goes to, set their own priorities for data collection, not have to have a donor set the priority, and contribute, really highly localized data, right? And decide how it's used, just like someone can trade internationally. And so, and it's ridiculous to think of a shipping company saying that because you ship something on my vessel, I own it, right? Like this is kind of a ridiculous concept in the world of physical goods. But that is basically how we think about it in terms of data, like data governance. And then, large companies and investors, this would provide all the kind of quantifiable data that you would need, and then it would be much easier to kind of regulate and to understand what's happening, what they're doing, and what's good and bad, and things like that, and pressure, and enforcement, and fraud prosecutions, things like that. Right, and governments can this would be, governments are also in the business of risk, right? Like risk to society, that's their job, threats and looking forward, and planning. So I think, George Marshall of the Marshall Plan, he has a great quote, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. And I think this kind of new logistics of data, would revolutionize the future of risk. It would really change the future of, it would tie risk and sustainability really closely together. And it would provide, data, new funding models and things. So, and I think what's needed to make this happen is that infrastructure, right? So, like what happened with logistics is that you had places like Rotterdam, spring up and things. So those are the key kind of components of that containerization of shipping. So essentially, we have all of the ingredients for success. They're just not put together correctly. So I would say that's kind of our future challenge right now. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
So, thanks for a really fascinating talk that raised lots and lots of questions in my mind, I'm sure in yours as well. So we have a few minutes left for questions. They can only come from the people in person, but we need you to speak into the microphone so that people online can hear what you're saying. So I've got a question there. And maybe you want to introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm working on a DPhil in climate ethics and policy. That was fantastic. So I just wanted to ask, you mentioned the importance of being able to quantify risk and feeding that into data. What about things that can't easily be quantified? And I'm talking about things like the value of nature, and especially when you're talking about ESG, there's so many things, social aspects that can't be coming from indigenous communities, etc. What do you do with that? Those things that are incommensurable.
Yeah, I think that's where this kind of common task approach, I don't know if it's that exact method, but that kind of philosophy at least, where you can make improvements on small things, right? And then they add up, and they'll layer. So like maybe you can't, maybe it's hard to answer that question now, but maybe you can value a particular type of nature product in a particular place, at a particular time. And then you do that in lots of other places. And then someone can do a meta-analysis and say, okay, what are the generalizable trends, and how, can we make predictions? And then we made a prediction, and then we can test it, with like back testing. So won't be done overnight, but I think that's how you would do it.
One up, back there.
Hi, thanks a lot for that presentation. I really like the risk approach. I completely agree with you on that. My name's Joseph Firetog. I'm a research fellow in sustainable finance at ODI, which is an international development think tank in London. I was going to ask you about TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I didn't hear it mentioned, but I wondered how it would fit in with your sort of data vision. I mean, surely if companies and investors are required to disclose their nature-related risks, that would help foster this. But I don't know whether there are pitfalls as well to consider. I'd be really interested in your views. Thanks.
Yeah, so I would say TNFD, as well as all the other frameworks that are being created, those are essentially domain models in a way. So they're like a model of how of what should be done. It's an epistemology, right? So it's like how what information is important, what outcomes are we trying to get, and things. So I think that's what they are, no more, no less, right? They're a framework, like literally. So I think they're, if they don't have data, if there's no data, then you can't assess the framework. You can't, and if you don't have enforcement, or you don't have a model for like an action model, or then they can be ignored. So yeah, and I think that's true for TCFD and yeah, that's true for United for Wildlife. It's a voluntary framework. These companies don't have to do it. Right.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, lots of information there. My name is Joe Anderson from Carbon Tanzania. We're a project developer for nature-based carbon assets. Your implication of the stochastic nature of ESG correlation suggests that we do need a sort of a one or at least a couple of very reliable ratings agencies for ESG. What's the process for one of those emerging? I mean, do you have a vision for that? Whose responsibility could that be, or would that be?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about that. But, I don't think this stuff, though, I think for something like that, it would have to involve science, and people with skin in the game, right? So the people who are actually impacted by these decisions, right? So I think those ratings would have to involve input from them, like powerful input from them. So I don't know if they would be part of that, some kind of company or something, but at least through like a playbook or a model that was developed. So these risk agencies would be using these playbooks that were developed, in this collaborative way, so that they would be legitimate. I would think that would probably be a requirement.
Hi, I'm Nitya. I'm from the MBA program, and I've worked in a women's labor union before this. One of the things you mentioned was that if those who are most proximate to ESG data did take on data collection, maybe we could have more access. So just wondering, are there examples of such organizations where those closest, or non-profit organizations, grassroots organizations, which are party in data collection?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a statistic, I think it's 90% of all NGOs collect data as part of their everyday activities. And then, I work mostly on wildlife, mostly in Africa, and I can, think of probably over a dozen NGOs that have a data person, and have data sets and do, or probably more. I mean, more, actually, I can think of a lot more if I include like SMART and technical sensor data, camera traps. I mean, yeah. So I think almost all NGOs are doing this, and that's where I think access to that data science education is really important. And that's something where there's trillions of dollars in the tech world, and it's something that could be really, really spread everywhere. And data science education in this way, not as in like we're going to teach people to use a tool, but the process of data collection, using any tool, using in a standardized way, setting those standards, normalization. But yeah, there's some great data work being done.
Hello, my name is Marcel. I'm an incoming default student at the School of Geography and the Environment here in Oxford. I'd be interested, you mentioned it is required to build this new data layer, the infrastructure. Do you see if there's a technological innovation which might be required to accelerate, to build this data structure, this foundational layer?
No, I think it could be built with existing technology completely. Well, it can only be, first of all, it can only be built with existing technology. But I think there's been huge advances in AI, and AI just being like, well, I've heard one definition of AI is just being anything cool computers can do. That's hard to explain. So I think, but with artificial intelligence, machine learning, there's, like entity extraction. We've been working on some stuff with, automated relationship and entity extraction, databasing of that, all the kind of sensor work, acoustic sensors, also predictive modeling. I mean, all of this is really, there's been actually huge advances in the last few years, especially, but so it's really not a technical issue, I don't think. It's an architecture issue.
Let me just throw in the buzzword of blockchain technology in order to verify the security and the properness, so to speak, of the data. Do you think it's needed as well, or is it even is it not even needed?
I think I'm neutral on the blockchain issue. So, yeah, I mean, if it works, then it works. So, but yeah, again, I don't think it's specific tools. It's more like because all of this you can do also with paper and pencil, right? And sometimes it's better to do it that way. So I think it really needs to be tool agnostic, technology agnostic.
Hello, Chris Day, engineer and environmentalist. Thinking of the metrics of data and value. If I take a 1,000-hectare wheat farm here in Oxfordshire, I can put value on the wheat. How would you put value on the skylark, especially when it's, we say, the last skylark in Oxfordshire?
I would have to leave that up to the Skylark domain experts. Yeah. No, but I mean,
we're doing work with ESG with a number of international companies looking at their lack of responsibility for plastics, and you can name it. ESG we see as being directed firmly at the finance department. Finance department's interested in shareholder value. The shareholders only place value on something which has a cash metric. So when you argue the case, but some shareholders may be stakeholders with other values, to be brutal, we find we make no progress at all.
Well, so I think one maybe additional point is that often these domains, right, these kind of specific topics, maybe they're relevant and they have value to things that you would never have thought about, right? Like indirect. Maybe there's situations where the Skylark data or the Skylark would have value to something that you would never have thought of that it might have value to. So I think you see this with, like, one example kind of on the same theme is with wildlife trafficking, like with shipping companies, where that was a process at the beginning. They were like, this isn't really a huge risk for them, right? And so how do we do? But then actually, one thing that they said is that actually trying to find illegal wildlife shipments within their network actually really helps them detect hazardous materials, right? Because they develop better ways to understand misdeclaration. There were some methodologies about like address fraud and document fraud that's used in wildlife trafficking that help them, detect other things. So that's where the wildlife trafficking data was actually really helpful for them detecting hazardous materials, which is something they do really care about because of, if you put a chemical on the top of a ship, it can heat up and explode or something. So that's something where, that's a use case that we would never have thought of, that would be related. So I would guess, and I think it's a safe assumption that because especially biodiversity is so interconnected, that there would be lots of uses, surprising uses for this data. And that was the point, is that maybe the data is partly what's valuable, not necessarily the Skylark to other people. It's actually the Skylark data that's valuable, but that's fine if it saves the Skylark.
Hello, my name is Gabriel. Firstly, thank you very much for the lecture. So my question is this. There's been work done on sort of psychologically profiling large corporations, and the result, apparently from what I understand, I'm not a psychologist, but they result to have psychopathic tendencies. Now, my question is this. So even if you collect all the data, distribute it, your sort of data logistics plan comes to perfect fruition. If you give a psychopath all the data about the harms that they may be doing to other people, why would that make them change their behavior? So I suppose my question is, we need much stronger regulation. We need policy involvement. We can't leave these sort of questions up to corporations to self-regulate, even given the data. because they're not bearing the costs, really. The externalities are being borne by others, aren't they? Would you agree with that or not?
Yeah, I agree 100%. So, no, I think that's, I mean, those are some, well, first of all, on the importance of regulation and enforcement, I mean, that's incredibly important, and having more quantifiable approaches helps enforcement and regulators, probably most of all, you know, and policymakers, and how they write the regulations, and what's, you know, so just like regulation on the financial aspects of companies is very specific and very quantified, and, you know, very thorough, and because all that's quantified. And so, and yeah, I mean, companies, I would, you know, they're probably definitely sociopathic, you know, and so, but I think, I mean, as an entity, but I think look, there's a couple points. One is that there's definitely, I think you have to assume, and this will be the case, that there's predatory companies out there and predatory actors that will take advantage of this to, as soon as you quantify nature and you quantify impact, they'll go to the other side and buy up cheap, but, you know, undervalued. That's how you make money, buy low, sell high. So you buy up a valuable piece of nature and then sell it, you know, at a higher price. I mean, that's how you make money. So, and then there's lots of people that will buy up the worst companies too, or the worst investments and the worst activities, right? Yeah, so I mean, that'll all happen. But I think overall, because of the real systemic risks to everybody and everything on the planet, I think that will kind of take care of itself if there's proper regulatory frameworks and proper enforcement.
May I ask a second question? Is that allowed?
Yes.
So my other question is about the sort of duration of investment horizons. So I think this is a really serious issue because many investment horizons are relatively short term. So when you're looking at bank-issued loans, for example, their duration is usually, average duration is 6 to 7 years, which isn't really long enough to take into account the negative impacts that those economic activities might have. Do you have any ideas on how to realign sort of short-term interests with long-term outcomes?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, you're identifying another huge problem. I mean, the short-term outlook, that was in one of the charts there. And I think, you know, if there was a universe of quantifiable data, you know, that's what predictions are. You know, so you could make a time series prediction. You know, people are discovering time value of money again now that there's actual interest rates. And, you know, so I think there's, you know, those longer term forecasts. You know, it's kind of like investing in the lamp oil industry in the, you know, 1910s or something like that, right, before all the whales died. You know, so that if you look at that industry, it's profitable, but 30 years later, it's gone because of biodiversity decline. And so, yeah, so that's, but again, that has to, there's definitely methodologies to do that, but you need the data.
Okay, so I want to leave a bit of time at the end for kind of casual chat with Tim, for anyone who'd like to do that, and bearing in mind also that Tim's going to be coming back to Oxford for a longer period as a visiting researcher to the Oxford Martin School, and so it would be great if he'll be around for people to talk to. So I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the last question, which is the obvious one, really. So with United for Wildlife, what made that work was a disinterested donor coming in and setting in train something for a longish period, albeit, as you say, with a small amount of money, to get this off the ground and to make something work. So now you're speaking about something that's very ambitious, you know, global systems. How are we going to get that kind of systemic change from when the incentives are all wrong? Who's going to pay for it? Speaking as someone who I think does something that might be useful for governments and industry, who don't, I mean, they have no interest in paying for it, in my experience. So how do you get that shift? Who's going to come in with all the billions? Or millions?
Yeah. Well, I think that's where I kind of came to the logistics metaphor, is that I think if you build the, if you build it, they will come. Like if you build the infrastructure, I think it seems like this is an infrastructure problem, right? That's the missing part. So if you would build the infrastructure, then it would be possible. Probably not. I mean, it wouldn't be. You couldn't do it for all issues immediately. But you could definitely do it for like biodiversity, or definitely specific parts of biodiversity. And I think as far as like paying for it, who would pay for it? I mean, I think the scale of the funding that's required is large to us, right? But I thought of there's a guy, Adam Newman, who's the WeWork billionaire, and then now he's got some other company. So I think he just received like $350 million. So I think if you put in like Newman units, so I think maybe for like, some decimal Newman unit, it would be, you could do it. So, I mean, compared to what these people spend on other things.
So we just need to convince Adam Newman to pay for it.
Or just someone, yeah. There's a lot of money in the world.
Okay, so I've just been asked before we finish to advertise another couple of really interesting and relevant talks that are coming up in this series. So on the 17th, we've got one which is on wildlife trade, which is on spider trade, which we don't often hear about. We hear a lot about ivory trade, but less about spiders. So on the 17th of October, also at 5 p.m, we'll have Who Wants to Buy a Spider? Insights on the global spider trade and the conservation, which will be absolutely fascinating. Come to that. And then on the 26th, we have Tropical Forests to 2050 Science Challenges for Researchers and Policymakers, again, very relevant, and again at 5 p.m. I don't have my specs, so I may be wrong, but I think that's approximately what it says on this bit of paper. So come along to those, and if I am wrong, then it's all on the Oxford Martin School website. So just like to say thank you very much to Tim. Thank you to you all for your really interesting questions. See you again soon.
Thank you.